Hello and welcome to your extra special report of week 4 of the Trump trial. And a fun reminder that we are in fact dealing with a nearly 80-year-old man having to sit day in and day out in this uncomfortable courtroom. We're also contending with an old decaying body. Reports are that he's falling asleep because he's not able to drink his usual daily 12 cans of Diet Coke, which I don't understand what it is with old men. Like, I get it. I love Diet Coke, but he's not the only old man I've heard of who has a Diet Coke obsession. I don't really get it. Reports are also, unclear if true, that he's just been farting it up in there, really letting it rip, which makes sense. I mean, the bowels have to be the first thing to go as you age, right? And then he's constantly complaining that it's cold, which, like, yeah, get this grandpa his blankie, y'all. Why are we letting this elderly man just freeze to death? To give you a concept of how terribly old this man is. He was born in June 1946. The top song the year he was born was by Perry Como. That Christmas, It's a Wonderful Life was a new box office hit. The United Nations held its first ever meeting that year. Italy became a republic. Only 6% of households had a TV. Like, this man is old. That's my point. The outsized role that he plays in our national conscience, I think, makes us forget that he's fucking decrepit. So I wanted everyone to just remember that. It's just a little starting note. Okay, let's dive in. Let's talk about Monday, shall we? Great. So Monday morning, judge holds Trump in contempt for a 10th time, charges him another $1,000. Last week, the judge threatened jail time to Trump, but that threat came after the prosecution brought these additional gag order violation charges. So jail wasn't on the table this Monday morning. Since Trump hadn't had that warning before, you know what I mean? The timeline doesn't line up. However, now it very well could be, jail very well could be on the table if he violates the gag order again. And the judge made clear that he did not want to jail Trump, but that is the next step to ensure that Trump understands the weight of his decision. The judge also acknowledged that he is a former president and could be the next president. So jail time is very serious and the judge does not take it lightly. And I thought that was interesting that the judge acknowledged Trump's special position, because I feel like a lot of this trial has been attempting to treat Trump like they would any other defendant, which is easier said than done. So Monday morning, we start fresh with a new witness, former Trump Organization controller Jeffrey McConney. He worked for the Trump Organization for 36 years, specifically on the financials. So he's able to give deep insight into the functioning of the Trump Organization, especially before and during the hush money payments. McConney also testified and was, in fact, a co-defendant to Trump in the Trump Organization criminal tax fraud trial. And in that trial, McConney admitted to breaking the law to help the company avoid paying taxes. McConney is basically the next closest thing they could get to 𝗬𝗠𝗠𝗏𝗡𝗏, the former Trump org CFO, who's currently in prison. On the stand, McConney testified about Trump and his micromanaging and his close oversight of Trump org financials. He testified that Weisselberg told him, McConney, that they had to reimburse Michael Cohen for the Stormy Daniels payout. So he's corroborating this story. Again, he was told it was a reimbursement. A lot of McConney's testimony revolved around him just kind of doing what he was told, not really being deeply in the know. He wasn't in the inner circle. Notably, though, he testified that the funds to reimburse Cohen were paid out of Trump's personal bank account. An important hiccup here, or detail here, is that Cohen was reimbursed in $35,000 monthly payments throughout 2017, after Trump was elected president. When he became president, Trump had to distance himself from his businesses and therefore the daily runnings and handling of money, etc. So the prosecution has to show that Trump knew about this scheme and these payouts, maybe not every single one, but that he was aware and orchestrated the scheme to pay Cohen back and list it as legal fees in an attempt to cover up, to conceal information and affect the outcome of the 2016 election. McConney testified that typically reimbursements aren't taxable, and yet in the official business records, they increased the reimbursement amount to account for taxes. The idea being that the money paid to Cohen was supposed to be seen as income, again, for legal fees, and not as a reimbursement. Again, this was meant to conceal that it was a reimbursement at all. The payments to Cohen were from Trump's personal account, and Trump was the only person who could sign off on the checks. And once Trump was in the White House in D.C., that became very difficult to get him to sign those checks when he was no longer physically in New York, according to McConney's testimony. Much of McConney's testimony was incredibly dry and boring. He went through various ledgers showing all of the payments and invoices to Cohen, but it was really important to get this all in because the prosecutors are alleging 34 separate counts of falsifying business records, so they need to get the physical evidence in for each of those 34 counts. And as the custodian of records, McConney was the guy to do it. One of the most important pieces of evidence from the McConney testimony was an invoice for Cohen's repayment that was saved in the Trump org records, and on the invoice was a handwritten note by 𝗓𝗓𝗏𝗧𝗏 laying out how they arrived at the total reimbursement number for Cohen of $420,000, which is the amount he was ultimately paid out. $130,000 was for Stormy. $50,000 is a separate expense, allegedly something having to do with paying off a company or someone to create poll numbers more favorable to Trump. And then there was a bonus for Cohen as well. But then also, they then doubled all of that, according to the note, for tax purposes. And this is important because they all knew this was a reimbursement for Cohen, not a payment for services rendered. Reimbursements don't require tax payments. When you get reimbursed for like a work expense you paid out of pocket, you just get all that money back. You don't have to pay taxes on that money. They give it to you as a reimbursement. So in the note, it says they doubled it to cover taxes so that we can infer it would look more like payment for services rendered, that is income that Cohen would have to then pay taxes on, as opposed to what it really was, allegedly, which was a reimbursement, which has been established that Trump knew about. So 𝗓𝗓𝗏𝗧𝗏 is paying Cohen $420,000 in total, and the defense's whole argument is, well, this wasn't illegal, but even if it was, Trump didn't know about it. Except the problem here is that the prosecution has over and over established that Trump is an extreme micromanager who was incredibly hands-on with the business, very stingy with his money, signed every check, and knew about everything that was going on. Further, 𝗬𝗧𝗏 needed to get approval from Trump before he spent anything over $10,000. So the jury is supposed to believe, according to the defense, that 𝗬𝗧𝗏, who's worked for the Trump org for literal decades, decided to go behind Trump's back and agree to pay someone $420,000 without Trump's knowledge. And Trump then signed monthly $35,000 checks as the payout of that $420,000 without ever asking, hey, what's this money for? Starting to look a little sus, okay? On cross-examination, Trump's lawyers questioned McConney to reinforce that Cohen was a lawyer and he was Trump's personal lawyer. Their argument appears to be that Cohen was just doing his lawyerly duties, and paying lawyers in legal fees is an incredibly normal and non-illegal thing to do. Isn't he a lawyer? These are just legal fees. Isn't that normal? It's all to downplay how weird and abnormal and, in fact, allegedly illegal this all is. They're doing that at every turn. Nothing to see here. This is just normal business. Trump's lawyers did get McConney to admit that after the election, the Trump organization was thrown into a lot of chaos. McConney also admitted he was never told by 𝗬𝗧𝗏𝗏 to enter the Cohen payments as legal expenses. That's just what they were listed in the invoice. And this throws into doubt the orchestration of the whole thing. Was it just chaos and oversight? That's not technically really probably a felony. So the next witness was 𝗬𝗥𝗢𝗏𝗧𝗏, accounts payable supervisor at the Trump organization. She also testified at the Trump org criminal trial, so we have some familiar faces in this courtroom today since this was the same room where that trial was held. 𝗢𝗏𝗧𝗏 is the one who prepared the checks used to pay Cohen. She testified that her work was to just do what she was told, and that 𝗓𝗓𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏 was her boss, and he was incredibly micromanaging and had his hands in everything. The idea being that she just did what she was told. This wasn't her thing. She didn't do anything to change this. She was following orders. And that this wasn't a mistake or something that happened outside of Trump's knowledge. He had people doing his dirty work for him. And he was doing that on purpose, because a common theme in these types of trials where they're trying to show an underlying scheme perpetrated by a CEO or a higher up in a company is showing that they were using underlings to do all their bidding for them to try to skirt the system and avoid blame. So that's what the prosecution is building on in these witnesses that happened on Monday. They then took 𝗪𝗓𝗧 through every individual check sent to reimburse Cohen, which were all sent to Trump while he was in the White House and signed by his big giant Sharpie and his chubby little baby fingies. Cross-exam of 𝗪𝗓𝗧 was short. The defense simply asked her to confirm Trump never told her directly to do any of this. Again, the big issue for the prosecution here is they need to connect the dots to show Trump's intent. There likely isn't a smoking gun, so it's a ton of circumstantial evidence for the jury to then draw the inference that there is no way that any of this would have happened without Trump knowing about it and approving it. The trial then ended early on Monday when 𝗪𝗓𝗧 left the stand. The prosecution announced that they were ahead of schedule and would likely be finished presenting witnesses in 2 weeks, meaning the defense will likely start its case around the 21st of May. The defense will likely have a week or so of testimony for its case, so this trial could wrap up by the first week of June. Okay, that's Monday. Moving on, Tuesday. Happy Stormy Daniels Day to one and all. So Tuesday morning, before the trial got underway, Trump's lawyer requested that the judge bar Daniels from discussing the details about her sexual encounter with Trump, saying it was irrelevant to a case about books and records. The prosecution argued that the details are important because they will support Daniels' credibility, which the defense has questioned. Like, it doesn't look great if they ask her about a sexual tryst and she's foggy on the details, you know what I mean? The prosecution assured the judge that the description of the sexual act would be really basic and would not involve any details of genitalia. And they no doubt asked about this because in her book, Stormy Daniels got very specific about the encounter with Trump. And let's just say she didn't have much nice to say about his genitalia. So the judge agreed with the prosecution to allow basic description and details, but cautioned them to keep it brief if possible. But before Daniels, the first witness on Tuesday was an executive at Penguin Random House, Sally Franklin. They published Trump's books, How to Get Rich and Think Like a Billionaire. That first one must have been just a single paragraph long. How to get rich? Ask daddy for a loan. It's easy to be rich. Anyway, the prosecution had Franklin read excerpts from Trump's books that detail his approach to business. It appears that the prosecution was trying to show that Trump was incredibly hands-on at his company, meaning there weren't going to be major oversights or hundreds of thousands of dollars spent without his knowledge and approval, and also that he was willing to retaliate against the people he perceived to have done him wrong. Among the excerpts includes, if you don't know every aspect of what you're doing down to the paper clips, you're setting yourself up for some unwanted surprises. And for many years, I've said that if someone screws you, screw them back. Also included excerpts praising penny pinching, and keeping a close eye on bills. On cross-exam, the defense emphasized that Trump worked with a ghostwriter on these books, so whether they're really his words is suspicious, but like, he signed off on them. I don't know, I think that's a weak argument. And with that, it was time for Stormy Daniels to take the stand. After testifying about her upbringing and how she got into porn films, writing, directing, acting, she testified that she met Trump at a celebrity golf tournament at Lake Tahoe in 2006. The adult film studio she worked for was sponsoring one of the holes on the course, which I think personally is iconic, sponsoring a hole. She said that they met in passing and he chatted with her and said she must be really smart if she's making these films. The jurors were also shown a now infamous photo of Trump and Daniels together at the golf tournament. And then Trump invited her out to dinner that night. That night, as instructed, she went up to his penthouse in the hotel where he was staying. He greeted her in the foyer of his suite in silk pajamas. She recalled saying, "Does Mr. Hefner know you stole his pajamas?" Sick burn. And he then immediately left to change into a suit. They then sat at a dining room table in his suite and he asked her many questions about the porn business. And Stormy Daniels testified that she was impressed because people usually just ask gross questions about the salacious stuff. And he was asking about the business side of it. And this is something that I always kind of underplay or forget about Trump and one of his sources of power. He is charming. Like, when he speaks at rallies, it sounds like he doesn't know how to put together full sentences, but he can work a room. He can charm people, and that gets you really far in politics. It's one of the reasons why Ron DeSantis didn't stand a chance. Everyone can tell he hates people and is incredibly awkward. Trump is not. So Daniel said that she asked him about Melania while they were in the hotel room, and he made a comment that they did not sleep in the same room, which, like, fair girl. He also dangled the idea that Daniels may be cast on the Celebrity Apprentice someday. And Daniels testified that the whole reason why she agreed to see Trump was partially for the plot. She didn't use those words, but basically, and also because it could help with her career if she made that connection. So him dangling Celebrity Apprentice in front of her, or The Apprentice generally, I think he knew what he was doing. That's the insinuation, at least. After speaking with Trump for 2 hours, Daniels had to go to the bathroom, and when she came out, she found Trump sitting on the bed in just boxers and a t-shirt, which she described as a jump scare. She said she was pretty freaked out, felt faint and scared, and Trump said, "I thought you were serious about what you wanted." The judge was quick to admonish the prosecution for getting into too much detail, and when they got to the actual sex part, the prosecutor asked Daniels to keep her answers brief and free of extra details, and the defense objected to a lot of her testimony, but even still, she was a bit of an unwieldy witness for the prosecution, and she shared more than I think even the prosecution wanted her to share, including what position they did it in, ew, and that he didn't wear a condom, also ew. She said the encounter was brief, and when it ended, she was shaking, I assume not from ecstasy. When it was done, she testified that he said, "That was great, let's get together again," and she just wanted to leave. She said she didn't feel threatened, but she did feel a power imbalance and that he was bigger than her and kind of standing in between her and the door when he propositioned her. And after the encounter, Daniels testified that Trump wanted to see her the next day. They met at a club for like 10 minutes. He seemed distracted. He then continued to call her, talked about getting together with her again. She said she told many people that she'd met Trump and went to his room, but only told a few closer friends about the sexual encounter at the time that it happened. She saw Trump a few more times. He continued to dangle the apprentice in front of her and telling her he missed her. Then in June 2007, he finally told her the apprentice thing wasn't going to happen, and their contact kind of fizzled out after that. Jumping ahead, in 2016, Daniels said she wanted to get her story out because she thought it was important for the election, not because she wanted money. She said that there was no interest in the story until after the Access Hollywood tape broke in October, a month ahead of the election. And after that, she learned that Cohen was interested in buying her silence. And reporters in the courtroom on Tuesday reported that the feeling in the room during Daniels' testimony, especially about the encounter, was incredibly tense. Trump seemed agitated. His son Eric was in the room and during the sex discussions turned bright red. Some reported that it felt like they were trapped in there with them hearing about incredibly personal, tense, heated details. Daniels was reportedly really nervous. She was talking too fast and making little jokes and chuckling to herself, but because the courtroom was so incredibly tense, the jokes did not land and made it all the more uncomfortable for everyone in there. At one point, the judge admonished Trump's lawyers because the judge said he could hear Trump cursing audibly. And then the trial took a lunch break. And when they came back, Trump's lawyers asked the judge to declare a mistrial because of Daniels' testimony. His lawyers argued that the extreme detail that Daniels provided, even with their objections, was so prejudicial that it would be impossible to come back from it, and the jury had been tainted by it. So a mistrial was required. And they must have had this discussion with Trump during the lunch break because he posted to Truth Social during the lunch break, "The prosecution, which has no case, has gone too far. Mistrial." And the judge rejected the request, saying, "I don't believe we're at the point where a mistrial is warranted." He pointed out that the defense should have objected more, that he sustained most of their objections, and that at one point, he, the judge, objected on his own to keep Daniels from giving too much detail. So it's on the defense if more was said than should have been. So no mistrial. After lunch, Daniels' testimony resumed. She said that when the story broke by the Wall Street Journal in 2018 that she was paid off for her silence, her life became total chaos. She said she declined to comment and didn't feel comfortable about a statement released on her behalf denying it because she was trying to abide by the NDA. She said she later sought to get out of the NDA so she could defend herself since she was silenced while the rest of the world gossiped about it, and she successfully sued and got the NDA nullified in 2018, going on to interview with Anderson Cooper and then writing and publishing her book. After prosecutors were done with their questioning, the defense began its cross-exam, and they asked her to confirm that she hates Trump and wants him in jail. She said she does hate him, but only wants him to be held accountable. The defense also asked her about negative comments she had made about Trump in the past, trying to paint her as incredibly biased against him, which could undermine her credibility to the jurors. They may think that she's willing to say anything because she hates him so much. The defense also clearly tried to show that Daniels was simply seeking to profit off her story, at one point suggesting she was trying to extort him. Again, this extortion theme, we saw it earlier in the defense's questioning of Daniels' lawyer, Keith Davidson. Again, signing an NDA and receiving money for it, not extortion, pretty common. Just a point to make. And the back and forth got heated with Daniels, and she vehemently denied that she was trying to get money out of Trump. And then at 3:30, court adjourned for the day with cross-exam to resume Thursday. Reminder, this was all on Tuesday. Court is not in session on Wednesday. So they ended kind of midway through cross-exam of Stormy Daniels on Tuesday. And then we move on to Thursday morning where we have Daniels again on the stand undergoing cross-examination. Again, it got very heated. Daniels' demeanor was incredibly stiff and at times combative during cross-exam. The defense continued to insinuate that she was simply trying to use this made-up story about Trump to get publicity, remain relevant, and make some money, which Daniels strongly denied. The defense attorney repeatedly referred to her work as porn and pornography, trying to really play up that she's in this like dirty, bad industry, whereas the prosecution always referred to it as adult film. Some of Daniels' testimony revolved around her work writing and directing films, and the defense asked whether, because she was so good at making up stories about sex to make money, why this was any different. To which Daniels responded that the sex in her films is very much real, just like the sex with Trump was. So not every attempt by the defense to discredit her was successful. Daniels did acknowledge that she made $800,000 on her book deal and sold the rights to her story for a documentary, but she also said that she had to spend tons of money on security and moving multiple times after the story broke, and that she still owes Trump thousands in legal fees because of a defamation claim her now defamed and debarred lawyer, not the one who testified, a different one, filed on her behalf against her will, she testified, which she lost so bad that the judge ordered her to pay Trump's lawyer fees too. And when asked, on balance, has publicly telling the truth about Mr. Trump been a net positive or net negative in your life? Daniels testified negative. The defense also tried to point out inconsistencies in her story throughout the years. Like at one point she said Trump asked her out to dinner, but at other points she said that it was his bodyguard who asked for him. But nothing that the defense pointed out was related to the story about the incident and the sex itself, in that her story has remained quite consistent in those points. And so some analysts are saying that the defense's strategy to discredit her may have actually backfired because the inconsistencies were so minuscule and she defended herself well. And there's, of course, no way to know because we weren't in the courtroom. We're not the jurors. It all depends on their opinion of what they're seeing. And a big piece of this testimony revolved around porn and sex. And interestingly, in the juror questionnaires and interviews, they were never asked about their views on porn and sex and the sex industry. So we don't really know how much her position as a porn star will affect jurors' opinions of her. And that's all that matters. So Daniels' testimony wrapped up on Thursday. She testified for a total of 7.5 hours. After Daniels, the prosecution called 𝗬𝗥𝗢𝗥𝗧𝗏 to the stand. She was a junior bookkeeper in the Trump organization. Her testimony was brief. She testified that she would FedEx the Cohen monthly reimbursement checks along with usually 10 to 20 other weekly checks, and those checks were then mailed back to the Trump organization, signed by Trump, usually within a few days. They used her to submit documents and evidence that showed Trump's personal checks were handled in Washington, D.C., which is important because they're connecting the dots between the checks and Trump. Next, the prosecution called Tracy Menzies, the senior vice president of production and creative operations at HarperCollins. She was acting as the custodian of records for the publishing company, and she read some excerpts from a different Trump book, Think Big, Make It Happen in Business and Life. I didn't know that he was such a prolific writer. The excerpts were about Trump's value of loyalty and about revenge. They're trying to use his own words against him, which is handy when he's written so many books. And then the final witness called on Thursday was Madeleine Westerhout, the former director of Oval Office Operations, who acted largely as Trump's personal assistant in the White House. She testified that the Access Hollywood tape rattled RNC leadership, who began having conversations about how to replace Trump on the presidential ticket if it came to that. A reminder that this happened 1 month before the 2016 election, which is important, again, to show that people understood, everyone around Trump understood that these salacious stories could be devastating to his campaign. Therefore, squashing them was necessary to ensure his election. This is all more circumstantial evidence to help the jury infer in the prosecution's favor that, beyond a reasonable doubt, Trump knew about the cover-up, orchestrated the cover-up, and did so to conceal the underlying crime to affect the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. Westerhout also confirmed that Trump did not use a computer or have an email address and only worked with hard copies of documents, which I thought was wild. She also testified that Trump was very upset about the Stormy Daniels story potentially coming out. She also testified about the process by which Trump got personal mail while in the White House, which is relevant because that's how he received and signed the monthly Cohen checks for his reimbursement. So apparently items were first sent to Trump's longtime bodyguard, which were then brought to the White House, where 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 would give them to Trump and then mail them back to New York. Or sometimes the items were sent to other Trump aides first instead of through the White House. And then in the middle of her testimony, proceedings were wrapped up for the day on Thursday afternoon with her cross-exam to continue Friday morning. At the end of the day on Thursday, the judge did address a couple more defense demands. First, they asked that the judge drop the gag order against Trump as it related to Stormy Daniels, arguing that since she's no longer a witness, her testimony is done, and then she should no longer be covered. Trump needs to be able to respond to the American people, according to his lawyer. But the judge denied the request, saying that Trump's track record spoke for itself, that he's concerned about the integrity of the trial as a whole, and the prosecution was worried that allowing him to speak out against Daniels would also silence other witnesses because it indicates that they would be at risk as well. The defense also asked, again, for the judge to call a mistrial for basically the same reasons they gave on Tuesday, that Daniels' testimony was so prejudicial that there's no way the jury won't be biased against Trump. And to this, the judge responded that the details that Daniels shared were relevant because they do lend an air of credibility to her story if the jurors choose to believe her. He also told the defense that they had opened the door for this testimony about the sexual encounter when, in their opening argument, they alleged that no sex had occurred. The jury has to choose who to believe, so the prosecution can present this evidence. This is relevant to the case, so no mistrial, he ruled. And then the court was adjourned until Friday. And outside the court, Trump appeared angry and told the reporters that the judge was corrupt. Moving on, Friday morning, last day of the week, it began again with Madeleine 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 cross-exam. She testified that the Trump checks were usually sent to aides because it would take packages a long time to make their way through the White House mail system, so they were trying to skirt around the system. The defense also elicited testimony from her that Trump frequently multitasked and signed many documents, including checks, without even looking at them or reviewing them. Though she did confirm he always signed the physical document and avoided using automated or digital signatures. When cross-examination ended, on redirect, the prosecution confirmed that the way that Trump got mail through his aides instead of having them sent through official White House channels meant that the letters and packages wouldn't have gone through the normal White House security screening. So he likes to skirt the rules, is what they're saying here. And then 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 left the stand. Next up was an AT&T employee named Daniel Dixon, and then after him, a Verizon worker named Jenny Tomalin, both to authenticate some phone records. Their testimony was so short that some reporters in the room didn't even bother mentioning what they testified about in the recaps that I read. Tomalin testified for a total of 12 minutes, to give you an idea of how short this testimony was. Reporters did say that jurors seemed fatigued and tired during this boring testimony. The nature of these trials involving white-collar crimes is that there's a lot of numbers and bookkeeping and technical testimony necessary to connect all of the dots. The prosecution has to do this to cover every single step, but it's not compelling, and they have to hope that the jury stays with them during the boring parts. And they probably threw these witnesses in after the Stormy Daniels testimony with the hope that the jury was bought in enough from her explosive testimony that they'd stay at least somewhat tuned in during the boring stuff. And these witnesses testified as to data, but not the actual contents of messages or calls. That has to come in some other way. It's just to prove on the back end what calls were coming and going, what data was being used, etc. This information will likely be used later by prosecutors who will be able to point to the records to say, see, this corroborates the testimony, probably of Michael Cohen, who, as we've discussed, is their star witness, but also comes with tons of baggage, including perjury convictions. So they have to do extra work to corroborate every single piece of testimony he gives. And this boring testimony about call records is one way to do that. Then, after a probably much-needed morning break, paralegal Georgia Longstreet from the DA's office was back on the stand. She already testified in this trial once about Trump's social media posts. Sometimes they'll do this because they're trying to paint a picture. They're trying to tell a story. So they wanted her testimony about one thing to come in earlier, and now they have more from her that they want her to give as well. Through her, they introduced Trump tweets showing he initially praised Michael Cohen after he came under federal investigation, then began bashing Cohen after Cohen pleaded guilty to campaign finance violations, including related to the Stormy Daniels payoff, likely to show that Trump was happy with Cohen until Cohen ratted him out, basically. Longstreet was also used to enter into evidence a text exchange between Daniels' manager and the National Enquirer editor right after the Access Hollywood tape leaked. The text exchange was a negotiation between the two over Daniels' story, over payment, which corroborates past testimony that indicated there was heightened interest in Daniels' story after the Access Hollywood tape leaked, because remember, there wasn't a ton of interest before, but then afterwards the tabloids were willing to pay a lot of money for it. She also read a number of tweets from Trump into evidence, including one from 2018 that said, Mr. Cohen, an attorney, received a monthly retainer, not from the campaign and having nothing to do with the campaign, from which he entered into, through reimbursement, a private contract between two parties known as a non-disclosure agreement, or NDA. Trump's lawyers had actually attempted to keep that tweet out of the trial, arguing that he had presidential immunity when he sent it, and that was clearly not a successful argument. It's basically Trump admitting that it was a reimbursement, and he knew about it at least in 2018 when he tweeted that. On cross-exam, the defense had Longstreet confirm that her review of social media posts didn't involve ongoing review of Michael Cohen, the defense attorney saying, "You're not aware of anything he TikToked, for example, 2 nights ago," which is funny. I've never heard TikTok used as a verb. And she confirmed that she does not review Cohen's content in an ongoing basis. The defense was likely referring to a TikTok live Cohen did earlier this week, in which Cohen was wearing a shirt featuring Donald Trump behind bars with his hands in handcuffs, which is apparently official Michael Cohen merch that he sells as part of his podcast. Which, again, not going to look great for him as a witness that he's profiting off this and continuing to post on social media. Anyway, Longstreet's testimony concluded shortly after that. Next up, J. Jermel Schneider, it's a mouthful, another paralegal from the DA's office who has worked with phone records, including Michael Cohen's phone. He testified specifically about a recording heard earlier in the trial, which the defense argued may have been doctored because it cuts off abruptly. And Jermel Schneider testified that Cohen received a phone call, according to the records, 22 seconds after that recording ended, basically to back up the prosecution's claim that it wasn't doctored. He just received a phone call, so the recording got cut off by the incoming call. Jermel Schneider also testified about call records between Cohen and Weisselberg, likely, again, to corroborate future testimony from Cohen. And then, because the prosecution's so ahead of schedule, court was adjourned early on Friday at around 11:30 a.m. The prosecution said they likely only have 2 witnesses left, including their star witness, Michael Cohen, who will likely take the stand on Monday. So it's entirely possible that the prosecution will rest by the end of next week. Next week, court will only be in session on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. They'll have their regularly scheduled day off on Wednesday, and then Friday, court will not be in session so that Trump can attend his son Barron's high school graduation. Oh, he's grown up so fast. Friday night, Trump will actually be right here in my neck of the woods in Minnesota to headline the Minnesota GOP's annual Lincoln Reagan dinner. Tickets start at $500 a plate, and the location will only be disclosed to attendees shortly before the event, which is probably a smart move on their part. Trump has made comments that Minnesota is in play, indicating that he sees this state as a viable state for him to win in November, which, we're solidly purple for sure, but, I don't think that's going to happen. Back in 2020, when he lost, he vowed to never come back to Minnesota again, and I'm sad he did not keep that promise. Anyway, tune in next Saturday for a roundup of what is likely the final week of the prosecution's case against Trump. As a reminder, it will then go to the defense to present their case by calling witnesses, if any, maybe Trump. Then the prosecution will have the opportunity for rebuttal, then closing arguments, and then it gets handed to jurors. So there are likely just a couple weeks left of this trial, and I will be here every Saturday to tell you about it. See you next week. Bye.